My name is Diane Bada. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and in this video, I'm going to talk about ambiguous loss. This is a type of grief that often goes unrecognized, and many times it is misdiagnosed as depression when it's actually grief, but it's actually extremely common. So I wanted to create this video because I think it could help a lot of people to have a term or a label for what they're experiencing, especially if they have not encountered that term before. Everybody loses things in life. It's part of the process, right? Ambiguous loss differs from regular grief, however, in that regular grief generally has a resolution. So if somebody dies, if somebody passes away, you know that they're not there anymore. You can come to accept that. Ambiguous loss, which is something that was coined by a psychologist named Pauline Boss in the 1970s, is different from regular grief and loss in that it doesn't have a resolution. That makes it even more difficult to deal with and to recover from. Many times, ambiguous loss leaves people in a state of limbo. They can't fully move on. It can lead to grief that lasts an indefinite amount of time. And because of that, it's very powerful. Well, here we go. I'm just going to go into a bit more detail about the different types of ambiguous loss, the psychological impact that it has. I'll give you some real life examples of different types of ambiguous loss, as well as some ways to cope with it a little bit better. There are main two types of ambiguous loss that were identified by Dr. Boss, which is an incredible last name also. The first is being physically absent but psychologically present. So in situations like this, a person is not physically around, but psychologically they are still in a person's mind. A person may feel, still emotionally attached to them. Some common examples of this would be a missing person. It's due to a natural disaster, war, abduction, something like that. Could be a loved one who has disappeared without explanation. You may see this in a situation where somebody has been abandoned, or a parent just leaves without really saying anything. You may also see this in divorce. So if a parent cuts off contact, whether due to the request of the other parent or the court or their own volition, the children will absolutely experience the ambiguous loss in that the parent is not physically present, but there is still an emotional attachment to them. Then there's the other type, basically the opposite situation. So when somebody is psychologically absent, but physically present. In these situations, obviously, a person is there, but they are mentally or emotionally unavailable. You can see this in mental illness. You can see this very evidently in cases of addiction. You can also see this with Alzheimer's disease or dementia. You can also see this in maybe shorter term situations where somebody is under a lot of stress or has gone through something very traumatic and they kind of pull into themselves and they're not behaving in the way that they normally do. In both of these situations, there's just a clear lack of closure, there's a lack of certainty, and so the proper resolution of grief is basically prevented. They are here but not here, they're gone but not really gone, something like that. Those two examples are obviously tough situations to deal with. So what is the psychological impact of this? How does this play out? How does this affect people? Ambiguous loss can lead to a lot of challenges, a lot of pain, just because it is so confusing. There is so much uncertainty. Common responses to something like this would be obviously chronic grief, right? Continuing to mourn something, not knowing when the mourning will end. Guilt. Sometimes people will blame themselves or think that they could have done more. They may also feel guilty for moving on if that's something that they need to do. There may be anger. There may be resentment towards the person that was lost, towards society for the circumstances that maybe led to the loss, especially if it was a situation where there was war or immigration due to political instability and things like that. Anxiety, depression, pretty obvious impacts. There can also be a major loss or disruption of identity when there is an ambiguous loss. Traditional roles, boundaries, they can be blurred when there is a loss that creates the need to move. There can be a massive shift in how a person views themselves. There can be the pressure and loss that comes with acculturation and all of that. There can be the grieving of a lost sense of belonging. as well. What are some real life examples of ambiguous loss? So I've mentioned some of these already, but to give you some more definitive examples, one would be Alzheimer's disease or dementia. So in situations like this, obviously the person's physically present, but it's almost as though the person that was known, their personality has faded, has changed, which can be very difficult to contend with emotionally because, you know, the person is there, still there, but the person you knew is not. So how do you mourn somebody who's still alive? How do you mourn the fact that they are not who they were previously? That can be very challenging and very difficult. Another major example is immigration or the refugee experience. So when you are forced to leave your country, this often comes about fairly quickly. There isn't a lot of time to wrap things up or to think about the impact that it's going to have. There isn't a lot of time to say goodbye to family members. There's absolutely no time to think about how this is going to affect how you view yourself, how you view the country that you left. As a result, there is a huge amount of ambiguous loss and grief in immigrant communities, and many times it just goes unacknowledged. You will often also see people self-medicating as a result of this. So people who develop addictions in the country that they move to cope with the grief that they don't realize is actually grief. That's actually a very common thing. Another major example, divorce or estrangement. So if a person is estranged from family members, it's a huge form of loss that doesn't really get resolved. You know, their family members are still alive, but they don't have contact with them. And so there can be a lot of tension, a lot of pressure in terms of knowing how to check in, or if they want to check in, knowing whether or not to try to push away feelings of attachment that are still there. This can come up quite often. One of the most commonly used examples of ambiguous loss, just because it's so clear cut, is a missing person. So if a child goes missing, for instance, the parents of that child have to contend with an incredible amount of ambiguous loss. How do you navigate hoping that they are still alive with maybe moving towards accepting the reality that they are not? This can be paralyzing. This can completely stop people in their tracks, and it can really prevent somebody from grieving a loss just because they don't necessarily want to give up hope. This last one was mentioned briefly as well, but mental illness or addiction. So obviously if somebody is mentally ill, they are not going to be themselves. They're not going to be the person you knew before that illness, especially if it's severe mental illness, schizophrenia, psychosis, bipolar disorder. The person may be, they are physically there, but mentally you cannot connect with them in the way that you used to. And then quite obviously severe addiction will completely transform a person's personality to the point where they can be unrecognizable, and where distance may be required if they are making choices that are harmful to other people, or if they've become very untrustworthy as a result of the addiction. Why is ambiguous loss so difficult? Aside from what was already said, there are a few other reasons why it can be particularly challenging. The first of those is that there really isn't social recognition for it. So in our society, we recognize and validate grief that's clear cut. So, the loss of a person, death, very obvious type of loss, and one that there is usually a ritual connected to. There's a funeral process, all of that. Loss of a job, also something that is clearly socially recognized as a loss. Because ambiguous loss is inherently ambiguous, it's harder for people to see. People don't always also recognize that they're experiencing a loss, so they might not talk about it as such, which can make it harder to receive support. Connected to that, if you're not recognizing something as a loss, you're not necessarily going to go and seek out community support, and there may not be support groups that exist for a loss that is unnamed, right? Another thing that makes ambiguous loss really tough, and something that I alluded to in one of the examples, is this idea of having hope versus trying to accept reality. Many times when there's an ambiguous loss, this is a delayed process. You may really want to hold on to hope. You may feel that you are doing the other person a disservice if you don't hold on to hope. On the other hand, if you hold on to hope for too long in situations where it is clear, or becoming more and more clear, that Hope should not be held onto. It can prevent the resolution of grief. Situations where people are stuck in grief for like 20 years, 25 years, I can almost guarantee that there's an ambiguous loss that is responsible for that. Most people will not be grieving for that long when the grief is clear cut. Where that is the case, it can be termed frozen grief, because the person is basically stuck. They can't move forward, they can't move back, and there's no full resolution there. Those situations are extremely difficult to encounter and work with clinically. I've encountered one situation where somebody was grieving something that happened over 20 years ago. Understandably, I did not choose to take on that case. Okay, what are some ways that a person can cope with ambiguous loss? What are some strategies that can be helpful? One, and probably maybe the most powerful, is to name it, to accept what it is, to recognize it. When you can label something as being ambiguous, confusing, unsteady, it makes it easier to deal with, ironically. It can also lead to finding different resources, finding different information that can help you understand it more fully and connect with other people who have experienced the same thing. Another helpful technique is to reframe the situation. So instead of seeking immediate closure, look to make peace with the ambiguity of the situation and the confusion of it. You can accept that, sometimes you're not maybe going to have all the answers, and that's fine, and it's often necessary. Another helpful thing, and something that's helpful in pretty much any situation, is to build a support system. So you can try to find friends to talk to about this. You can see if there are specific support groups for people who are going through a divorce, or people who have recently moved to a new country, people who have a missing family member, people who have a family member who is going through dementia or mental illness. These can all be very powerful for helping a person who's dealing with those losses. Another thing that can be helpful is to focus on what you can control. Going through an ambiguous loss can make somebody feel totally powerless. So establishing routines, maybe finding a creative outlet, finding ways to give back, volunteering with others who might need your help. These are all things that can both strengthen your sense of community and belonging, and help you connect with others, while also contributing to a sense of healing and moving forward, which is very important. Lastly, seeking professional help, meeting with a therapist, probably goes without saying since you're watching this channel, but that is also something that can be very helpful in these situations, just to have somebody to process your experience with. Okay, why does something like this matter? Why should we talk about it? It matters because it's becoming more common. Unfortunately, due to things that are happening in our world, people are having to move more. Sometimes that's a choice, sometimes it's not. But as a result, you have a lot more people who are displaced. We are having more people with neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia living longer and longer. We're also having more mental health crises, unfortunately. So we have a lot of situations where there is ambiguous loss that just aren't being recognized. And as a result, you have more people impacted by it and touched by it. Ambiguous loss is painful, it's confusing. Because there is no definitive end in sight. Anytime something is unexplained, or there is a lack of closure, it's going to make it very, very challenging to navigate and move past. One thing that can be very powerful when there is this type of loss is to seek out a way to create meaning from it. Along with this, you can seek out ways to seek support. The great irony, in many difficult situations, the one thing that can keep people moving forward is a sense of hope. What happens in situations of ambiguous loss is that sometimes holding on to that hope is the very thing that holds a person back. So figuring out a way to accept uncertainty while also creating a space to heal, creating spaces to find support from other people, and maybe finding a creative outlet that can be beneficial in helping one express what they're going through. All of those things can be very vital to the experience of something who's moving through this. I hope that this was helpful. I'm glad that my voice held up as I moved through the end of a cold. Yeah, I appreciate you taking the time to watch this. It's been my goal to try to create a video at least once a month. At one point I was saying once a week, and that is probably not going to happen, but once a month feels more doable. So if you liked this, you can comment, you can like, subscribe, all of those things. You know what to do. And I look forward to creating a new video soon. Take care.